The silence arrives almost unnoticed. For years the air had carried familiar sounds. Distant engines crossed the sky before dawn. Boots struck cobblestones with practiced certainty. Church bells sometimes rang through smoke that dulled their voices before they reached the next street. Even destruction developed its own rhythm, becoming something people measured almost without thinking, another part of the weather that governed each ordinary day. Now the sounds have withdrawn, leaving behind an unfamiliar stillness that seems larger than the city itself. It settles among broken walls and empty windows, filling spaces where conversations, machinery, and commands once competed with one another until silence itself feels uncertain, as though no one yet trusts it to remain. Morning light spreads cautiously across piles of brick that were once apartments, bakeries, schools, and quiet family kitchens. The outlines of streets still exist, but many have become difficult to recognize. A staircase climbs upward without reaching a room. A chimney stands alone against the pale sky. Curtains stir gently where there is no longer a wall to shelter them. Somewhere beneath fallen beams, a clock has finally stopped after continuing faithfully through bombardment, fire, and collapse, marking hours that no longer belong to the life it had once measured. You find yourself observing a city that seems caught between disappearance and return, where every familiar landmark has become slightly unfamiliar, as though memory itself must learn the streets again. People emerge slowly into this altered landscape. They do not rush, because there is nowhere that urgently demands their arrival anymore. Many carry small bundles wrapped carefully in blankets or cloth, containing possessions that survived only because someone chose them quickly before leaving a burning building weeks or months earlier. Others walk with empty hands, not because they need nothing, but because there is simply nothing left to carry. Faces remain quiet. Few celebrate. Relief exists, certainly, but it arrives beside exhaustion so complete that emotion itself has become difficult to distinguish from simple physical survival. The end of war does not resemble the beginning of peace. It resembles uncertainty wearing unfamiliar clothes. Every street corner asks practical questions before emotional ones. Is the bridge still standing? Does the well still provide clean water? Which buildings remain safe enough to enter? Has anyone seen the family that lived across the square? The answers come slowly, often carried by neighbors who themselves know very little beyond what they witnessed during the previous afternoon. Rumors travel more quickly than certainty. One person believes trains are running again. Another insists they are not. Someone claims a nearby village escaped destruction almost entirely. Someone else quietly shakes their head. Across Germany, millions experience this same morning in different surroundings but beneath remarkably similar conditions. Great cities lie fractured after years of bombing, while smaller towns count missing sons, fathers, daughters, and neighbors whose absence has become part of daily conversation. Roads fill with displaced civilians pushing handcarts or bicycles burdened with everything that remains of former lives. Former soldiers drift homeward in worn uniforms that no longer represent an army, moving carefully through landscapes where military victory and military defeat have become almost meaningless beside the immediate demands of hunger, shelter, and reunion. The nation itself has ceased to function as it once had. What remains are individuals confronting the much smaller, much quieter task of deciding how to begin another ordinary day. Inside houses that still possess roofs, families gather around tables assembled from mismatched chairs rescued from damaged rooms. Meals have become modest calculations rather than familiar routines. Bread, potatoes, dried vegetables, and whatever can be found or exchanged determine the rhythm of conversation. Children notice changes adults hope they will ignore. They ask whether school will reopen. They wonder when electricity might return. They ask about fathers who have not written for months or brothers whose last letters arrived before winter. Adults answer carefully, sometimes with honesty, sometimes with silence that carries equal weight. Outside, spring continues its patient work regardless of human history, allowing weeds to push through cracked pavement and birds to settle among shattered rooftops as though destruction was simply another season. The war has ended. The ordinary work of living has not yet remembered how to begin. Before we continue walking these quiet streets and watching ordinary lives begin the difficult work of beginning again, take a moment to settle into the silence they inherited. And if these calm journeys through history help you slow your own thoughts, consider subscribing, leaving a quiet like, or simply returning for another evening among the overlooked lives that carried history forward one ordinary day at a time. You're listening to Echoes of War. The first days after surrender possess a peculiar quality that later generations often struggle to imagine. History remembers declarations, signatures, commanders, and maps whose borders shift beneath carefully drawn lines. Ordinary people remember something much quieter. They remember standing in doorways without knowing where to go next. They remember opening cupboards already emptied by years of rationing. They remember listening for familiar footsteps that never arrived. They remember discovering that peace, unlike victory, offered very few instructions for the following morning. Across the country, familiar habits linger even after the institutions that created them have vanished. Bakers wake before sunrise because they always have, although flour has become scarce and ovens stand damaged. Railway workers walk toward stations where twisted tracks disappear beneath collapsed bridges, driven less by expectation than by years of routine that cannot simply be abandoned because governments have changed. Farmers step into fields whose boundaries remain recognizable despite everything else that has altered, planting seeds with the cautious understanding that harvest belongs to a future still impossible to picture clearly. The body remembers its work before the mind fully accepts the world surrounding it. You begin to notice how quickly survival narrows human attention. The immense political collapse unfolding across Europe exists, but it is experienced through remarkably small observations. A woman discovers that rainwater collected overnight is cleaner than the water flowing from a damaged pipe. An elderly man carefully straightens loose bricks outside what remains of his doorway, not because rebuilding can begin today, but because clearing a single path makes tomorrow slightly less difficult. Children invent games among ruined walls, stepping around dangerous places with instincts adults wish they did not already possess. Even laughter returns cautiously, almost apologetically, surprising those who hear it after so many months of fear. The landscape itself carries visible reminders that this is not merely another difficult year but the conclusion of something vast. Burned vehicles remain where fuel, time, or necessity force them to stop. Telephone wires sag between leaning poles. Bridges that once carried trains and bicycles alike now end abruptly above rivers that continue their slow movement toward distant seas without acknowledging the interruption. Forests conceal abandoned equipment gradually surrendering to weather, while fields contain shell craters that farmers quietly work around until they can someday be filled. Nature neither celebrates nor mourns. It simply continues, offering growth wherever enough soil and sunlight remain. Not every journey leads home. Across roads stretching east and west, countless civilians continue walking with destinations that shift each time new information reaches them. Some travel toward towns where relatives may still be waiting. Others travel away from regions they can no longer safely inhabit. Mothers balance children upon overloaded carts while grandparents pause often to recover strength before continuing another few kilometers. Entire conversations take place between strangers who exchange directions, fragments of news, or the location of a functioning well before parting forever. For many, movement itself has become the only certainty. Arrival belongs to another day. Within homes that survived, another kind of work quietly begins. Dust settles over objects untouched for months. Windows are covered with blankets where glass no longer exists. Broken furniture is repaired rather than replaced because replacement belongs to a different economy, one that has not yet returned. Families count candles, save scraps of cloth, preserve pieces of wire and nails that would once have been discarded without thought. Every object acquires new value because every object postpones another difficult search. Scarcity teaches a patient attentiveness that prosperity rarely requires. There are also absences that cannot be measured with inventories. Empty chairs remain where someone once read newspapers after supper. A coat continues hanging beside a doorway because removing it would feel too final. Letters are unfolded repeatedly until the paper softens at the creases, their familiar words offering comfort despite providing no new answers. Entire neighborhoods learn to recognize one another's waiting without speaking about it directly. Questions asked gently. News is shared carefully. Silence often becomes the kindest response when certainty is impossible. As weeks begin replacing days, another realization slowly emerges. Rebuilding will demand far more than bricks, timber, or machinery. It will require people to rediscover ordinary trust in places where authority has collapsed, to cooperate with neighbors whose wartime experiences may have been profoundly different, and to imagine futures that extend beyond immediate survival. Such changes cannot be accomplished through proclamations. They grow quietly through countless ordinary decisions repeated day after day, each one almost too small to notice until together they begin altering the shape of life itself. Before we continue walking these quiet streets and watching ordinary lives begin the difficult work of beginning again, take a moment to settle into the silence they inherited. And if these calm journeys through history help you slow your own thoughts, consider subscribing, leaving a quiet like, or simply returning for another evening among the overlooked lives that carried history forward one ordinary day at a time. Streets that no longer recognize. The first full morning begins without ceremony. No bell announces that one chapter of history has closed and another has quietly opened. Instead, daylight slips across broken rooftops with the same indifferent patience it has always possessed, revealing details that darkness had mercifully concealed. A row of houses appears almost intact until the sun reaches their upper floors, exposing empty interiors where ceilings have collapsed one upon another. A bicycle leans against a wall that no longer belongs to a building. A garden gate still swings gently on its hinges, although the path beyond it disappears beneath fractured masonry. The familiar geography of ordinary life remains present, yet every landmark now asks to be identified once again. Those who leave their homes move carefully, not only because rubble makes every step uncertain, but because habits formed during years of danger have become impossible to abandon overnight. Eyes continue searching the sky before crossing open streets. Conversations remain subdued even when no aircraft can be heard above the clouds. Doors are opened cautiously. Corners are approached slowly. The body often learns peace more gradually than governments declare it. Long after official surrender, muscles continue remembering urgency that the mind no longer wishes to obey. A woman carrying 2 empty buckets pauses beside what had once been the neighborhood bakery. The brick oven still stands within the shattered building, its heavy chimney blackened by years of use and more recent fire. She remembers the smell that used to drift across the square before dawn, when warm bread reached the shelves while children hurried to school and workers stopped briefly before beginning their day. The memory arrives with remarkable clarity, stronger for a moment than the ruin before her. Then the present quietly returns. There will be no bread from this oven today. She adjusts the buckets in her hands and continues toward a public pump where others have already formed a patient line. Waiting becomes one of the defining rhythms of civilian existence. People wait for water because pipes have burst beneath damaged streets. They wait beside municipal offices that possess few answers but remain one of the few places where questions may still be asked. They wait for notices listing prisoners recently identified in distant camps. They wait outside temporary kitchens distributing modest portions of soup prepared from whatever ingredients local authorities have managed to collect. The waiting itself develops routines. Faces become familiar. Conversations begin cautiously before growing slightly longer with each passing morning. Shared uncertainty creates quiet communities long before formal institutions recover enough strength to do so. You notice that even silence has acquired different meanings. During the war, silence often carried warning. It suggested that something unseen might soon arrive. Now silence frequently allows people to hear entirely different sounds. Hammers strike salvaged timber somewhere beyond the next block. Someone sweeps broken glass from a doorway into neat piles. A child laughs after discovering a marble beneath loose bricks, holding it aloft as though it were an unexpected treasure. Pigeons settle confidently upon roofless walls, no longer startled by explosions that had driven them repeatedly into the air. These modest sounds do not erase what came before them. They simply begin occupying spaces where louder noises once lived. Roads leading into the city bring a constant procession of unfamiliar figures. Some arrive carrying military blankets folded around civilian clothing. Others push handcarts whose wheels complain against uneven stones, every possession arranged with extraordinary care because there is no room for waste. Families travel together when they can, though many groups consist only of those who happen to find one another during the long months of movement across collapsing fronts. Each arrival carries its own private history, yet from a distance they appear remarkably similar. Dust clings to coats regardless of where the journey began. Faces reveal the same careful attention given to wells, churches, railway stations, and notice boards where any fragment of reliable information might appear. For municipal workers who remain at their posts, familiar responsibilities have become almost unrecognizable. Streets must still be cleared, but there are too few vehicles and far too much debris. Water systems require repair, though replacement parts have become scarce and skilled laborists are often missing. Records must somehow be preserved despite damaged offices, scattered documents, and changing authorities who request entirely different kinds of information. Many continue working because someone must. Their occupations have lost much of their previous structure, yet the quiet discipline of showing up each morning provides one of the few remaining forms of stability available to the communities around them. Throughout the neighborhoods, people begin learning a new way of looking at buildings. Before the war, a house had been judged by its comfort, its appearance, or perhaps its location. Now it is judged first by whether the roof still keeps out rain, whether the walls remain strong enough to survive another winter, and whether one room can be made warm when colder months eventually return. Entire families gradually retreat into single surviving corners of homes that once seemed comfortably spacious. Bedrooms become kitchens. Dining rooms become workshops. Cellars that had served as bomb shelters become storerooms for salvaged wood, preserved vegetables, and every useful object that might spare another journey through the ruins tomorrow. As the sun climbs higher, light softens the sharp edges of destruction without concealing them. Dust suspended in the air catches the morning brightness, giving collapsed streets an almost peaceful appearance from a distance. Yet every few steps reveal reminders that these are not abandoned places but living neighborhoods attempting to recognize themselves again. Laundry hangs between damaged walls because clothing must still be washed. A window frame without glass supports flower pots rescued from a shattered balcony because someone refused to let them die. Smoke rises from improvised stoves assembled inside roofless courtyards where families prepare simple meals beneath open skies. Ordinary life has not returned. It has merely begun searching for places where it can quietly continue. As afternoon settles over the city, the pace of movement changes almost imperceptibly. Morning had been devoted to searching, collecting, and discovering what another night had altered. Now the work becomes more deliberate. Small groups gather beside damaged buildings to remove loose bricks one by one, stacking those still intact into careful piles for some future repair that no one can yet schedule. Bent nails are straightened instead of discarded. Broken doors become firewood or temporary tabletops. Window frames without glass are lifted free and carried home because timber has become as valuable as bread. Nothing that survives the destruction is regarded as worthless if it can postpone another shortage. There is little machinery to accomplish these tasks. Fuel is scarce, vehicles are damaged, and many roads remain blocked by fallen masonry or collapsed tram lines. Most of the rebuilding begins with hands that have already spent years carrying burdens. Men and women work beside one another with few distinctions between occupations that had once separated daily life. A former clerk hauls stones into a wheelbarrow. A schoolteacher helps patch a leaking roof with salvaged tar paper. An elderly carpenter studies fractured beams with the patient attention of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding wood, quietly explaining which pieces might still bear weight and which must never again support a family. Skill survives even when the workshops where it was learned have disappeared. You begin to notice how often people pause before entering buildings they once knew intimately. Familiarity no longer guarantees safety. Floors may have weakened after months of rain. Staircases end unexpectedly where upper stories have collapsed into lower rooms. Walls that appear solid from the street reveal dangerous cracks once viewed from within. Every doorway demands a brief moment of judgment before someone commits their weight to uncertain ground. Children learn these cautions quickly, watching adults test loose boards with careful footsteps and listening for sounds that suggest hidden instability beneath the dust. The churches scattered throughout towns and cities acquire new roles without abandoning their old ones. Some continue to offer quiet services for congregations smaller than they once welcomed, their damaged interiors illuminated by candles where electricity has not yet returned. Others serve as distribution points for food, blankets, or clothing gathered from surrounding districts. Lists of missing relatives are pinned beside hymn boards. Notices announcing temporary shelters appear beside passages of scripture copied neatly onto scraps of paper. The buildings become places where practical necessity and private grief occupy the same space, each acknowledged without overshadowing the other. Those who enter often leave carrying little more than a few potatoes, a blanket, or a new piece of uncertain information, yet they also carry the reassurance that other lives continue alongside their own. Markets slowly begin to reappear, though they resemble conversations more than commercial exchanges. Coins have lost much of their familiar certainty. Goods themselves often possess greater value than the currency intended to purchase them. A handful of flour may be exchanged for soap. A repaired pair of boots might secure several meals. Someone offers sewing needles in return for cooking oil. Another brings carefully folded linen inherited from earlier generations, reluctant to part with it yet aware that sentiment cannot feed children through another week. Transactions unfold patiently because each decision carries consequences extending far beyond the present afternoon. Every exchange reflects not abundance but careful calculation. Alongside these practical negotiations, another quieter process begins unfolding across neighborhoods. People slowly account for one another. Windows that remain dark day after day provoke gentle inquiries rather than assumptions. A neighbor knocks softly before entering a damaged house whose occupants have not appeared recently. Someone returning from another district carries news about a cousin believed missing. A former prisoner is recognized while walking uncertainly along a familiar street, thinner than memory expected yet unmistakably alive. Reunions are rarely dramatic. More often they begin with long moments of silent recognition before practical concerns immediately follow. Is there somewhere to sleep? Have you eaten today? Who else has come home? Questions about survival naturally precede questions about the past. Not every absence is resolved. In many homes, uncertainty becomes a permanent resident. Families continue setting aside hope because abandoning it entirely feels like another form of surrender. Letters are written to distant offices that may or may not still exist. Names are copied carefully onto registration lists maintained by local authorities attempting to reconnect scattered lives across a continent transformed by war. Railway stations, though only partially functioning, become places where expectation gathers almost as steadily as passengers. Every arriving train invites quiet observation. Every unfamiliar face is examined for resemblance to someone remembered from years before. Sometimes recognition appears. More often the waiting simply continues into another day. As evening approaches, smoke begins rising from hundreds of improvised chimneys across the battered city. Thin columns drift into cooling air before merging above rooftops that no longer form complete skylines. The scent is different now, less dominated by fire and destruction than by damp wood, simple meals, and the ordinary effort required to create warmth. Windows glow unevenly where candles or oil lamps replace electric light. Behind those faint illuminations, families divide modest suppers, mend worn clothing, clean salvage tools, and quietly prepare for another morning that will ask much the same of them as today has done. Darkness no longer conceals advancing bombers, yet it still carries uncertainty enough to encourage early rest. People retire not because their work has been completed, but because daylight alone makes most tasks possible. Beds are often improvised from mattresses rescued from damaged homes, blankets shared between several family members, or straw spread across wooden floors. Comfort has become a modest ambition rather than an expectation. Outside, the ruined streets gradually empty until only the occasional footsteps of someone returning late from another district disturb the quiet. Above the city, the night sky appears unexpectedly clear. Many buildings that once blocked the view have vanished, allowing constellations to emerge above neighborhoods that had long forgotten how open the heavens could seem. The stars offer neither explanation nor judgment. They simply remain where they have always been, watching over streets that no longer recognize themselves, and over the people who, despite everything that has been lost, will rise again with the morning to continue the patient work of remembering how ordinary life is built. The measure of an ordinary day. Morning begins not with confidence but with repetition. The first days after the surrender had been filled with discovery, each walk revealing another collapsed building, another missing neighbor, another unexpected survival. Now the rhythm changes almost without notice. The extraordinary slowly gives way to something quieter. People begin measuring time not by dramatic events but by recurring necessities. Water must be collected again. Fuel must be found again. Meals must somehow be prepared again. In this altered Germany, routine becomes one of the first foundations upon which recovery quietly rests, even while almost everything that once supported routine has disappeared. Before sunrise, narrow paths begin to form through the rubble as though invisible roads are gradually replacing the shattered ones beneath them. They are not official streets, merely the routes that hundreds of feet have found most practical during recent weeks. Boots wear away loose dust. Wheelbarrows leave shallow tracks between broken masonry. Children learn instinctively which corners flood after rain and which staircases remain too dangerous to climb. Without maps or instructions, entire neighborhoods slowly teach themselves how to move again. Familiar geography is not restored. It is patiently reinvented. Inside surviving homes, mornings have become exercises in careful economy. Fires are lit only after someone has calculated whether the remaining wood will last until evening. Water heated for tea may later be used to wash dishes before cooling enough to scrub clothing. Ash from yesterday's fire is sifted because fragments of charcoal still hold enough warmth to assist today's cooking. Every object performs several tasks before its usefulness is exhausted. Nothing leaves the household casually anymore. Even broken fabric is folded neatly into piles for future repairs, patches, or bandages whose purpose has not yet been imagined. A woman kneels beside a worn wooden table repairing a coat whose original color has become difficult to remember beneath years of weather, smoke, and careful mending. The sleeves have already been shortened once for a younger child, then lengthened again as another winter passed. Fresh cloth is stitched over older patches until the garment begins resembling a quiet record of endurance more than a piece of clothing. Nearby, a boy patiently unravels damaged wool from an old sweater so that the thread may be knitted into socks before colder months return. Such work occupies hours rather than minutes. It asks for attention instead of speed. Across countless homes, similar hands perform similar tasks without ever meeting, connected by the shared understanding that preservation has become more valuable than replacement. You begin to recognize how differently scarcity alters the experience of time. In prosperous years, convenience shortens ordinary labor until many tasks disappear almost unnoticed into the rhythm of daily life. Here, every necessity stretches gently across the day. Washing requires carrying water before heating it. Cooking depends upon finding fuel before preparing ingredients. Repairing a roof begins with searching for usable timber scattered among several ruined buildings. The day does not feel hurried despite the abundance of work. Instead, each practical obligation unfolds patiently because there are simply no shortcuts left to follow. Food remains the quiet center around which nearly every household organizes its decisions. Markets function unevenly, harvests remain uncertain, and transportation has yet to recover enough strength to connect towns reliably. Gardens once devoted to flowers are transformed into vegetable plots wherever the soil still allows cultivation. Empty courtyards shelter rows of beans, cabbage, onions, and potatoes planted between fragments of brick and twisted metal. Windowsills support boxes of herbs carefully tended because even modest flavors brighten meals whose ingredients seldom vary from one week to the next. Those fortunate enough to keep chickens guard them attentively, knowing that a handful of eggs represents nourishment impossible to replace through ordinary shopping. The conversations surrounding meals have also changed. Once they might have wandered toward holidays, local gossip, or plans for the coming months. Now discussion often begins with practical observations. Which bakery reopened yesterday? Has anyone heard whether flour arrived at the neighboring district? Is the communal kitchen serving soup tomorrow afternoon? Someone mentions hearing that farmers beyond the river may soon bring vegetables into town. Another quietly doubts the rumor but hopes it proves true. Expectations have become modest enough that even uncertain news possesses genuine value. Outside, bicycles once abandoned for lack of tires or spare parts gradually return to the streets in remarkable variety. Some carry mismatched wheels scavenged from several different machines. Others have wooden pedals fashioned by local craftsmen after the originals broke beyond repair. Chains are cleaned repeatedly because replacements scarcely exist. Saddles are patched with leather cut from worn bags or discarded furniture. The bicycles appear imperfect, yet they move steadily through the city carrying milk, tools, bread, letters, and occasionally children balanced carefully upon improvised seats. They become quiet symbols of a society rediscovering movement through ingenuity rather than abundance. The sounds accompanying these mornings continue changing as well. The sharp crashes of collapsing walls become less frequent as dangerous structures are gradually removed or stabilized. In their place comes a softer collection of ordinary noises that had once seemed too insignificant to notice. A saw moves steadily through salvaged timber. Someone beats dust from blankets hanging over a broken fence. Buckets scrape against stone wells polished by constant use. Church clocks, where mechanisms still function, once again divide the day into familiar hours. None of these sounds announces recovery. Together, however, they suggest that life has begun organizing itself around something more enduring than mere survival. The routines remain fragile, incomplete, and often exhausting, but with every repetition they become slightly less temporary, quietly teaching a wounded country how to inhabit another ordinary day. By midday, the city settles into a quieter rhythm that differs from the urgency of the early morning. Those who searched for water have returned home. Those assigned to clear streets or repair damaged utilities pause briefly to eat whatever simple meal has been prepared. The movement through the neighborhoods becomes less purposeful and more continuous, as though the entire community has accepted that recovery will not be measured by dramatic achievements but by thousands of modest tasks completed without ceremony. Each afternoon resembles the one before it, and in that resemblance there is a cautious kind of reassurance. Children, who had spent so much of their young lives adapting to disruption, begin discovering forms of normality that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Empty lots created by collapsed buildings become open spaces for games assembled from imagination rather than purchased toys. A worn football stitched together several times over passes between boys whose fathers may still be absent. Girls draw patterns in the dust with pieces of broken brick, inventing games whose rules change as quickly as the afternoon light. Older siblings quietly watch the youngest while adults continue working nearby, creating an unspoken system of care shared across entire streets rather than confined to individual households. Childhood returns cautiously, though it carries memories far older than the years of those living it. Schools reopen slowly, often long before proper classrooms become available. Lessons are held wherever shelter can be found. A surviving church hall, an undamaged farmhouse, or the largest remaining room in a municipal building may serve as a classroom until something more permanent can be arranged. Desks seldom match. Books are shared between several pupils. Blackboards are repaired repeatedly because replacements do not exist. Teachers arrive carrying more than lessons. They bring a familiar rhythm that had almost disappeared from children's lives. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography regain importance not simply because they prepare students for adulthood, but because they restore the comforting expectation that tomorrow's morning will resemble today's. For many teachers, the classroom has become an exercise in gentle reconstruction rather than instruction alone. They observe children who struggle to concentrate after years of interrupted education and constant uncertainty. Some pupils have moved repeatedly from one town to another. Others have returned from evacuation in unfamiliar districts. Many sit beside classmates whose family histories differ profoundly, though few yet possess the language to describe those differences. Lessons therefore proceed patiently, allowing routine itself to perform much of the healing. The familiar act of raising a hand before speaking, copying words onto paper, or waiting quietly while another student reads aloud gradually rebuilds habits of ordinary civic life that extend well beyond education. You notice that clothing tells quiet stories throughout these classrooms and streets. Sleeves rarely match jackets perfectly. Shoes have been repaired so many times that original leather and replacement pieces have become almost impossible to distinguish. Buttons differ in size and color because families sew on whatever can be found. Children often wear garments once belonging to older brothers, sisters, cousins, or neighbors, carefully altered to fit smaller bodies. None of this appears unusual anymore. Scarcity has created its own quiet sense of dignity, where careful maintenance reflects responsibility rather than poverty. A neatly mended coat carries as much respect as a new one once did. Across the city, small workshops begin reopening behind repaired doors and patched windows. Cobblers once again examine worn boots whose soles have crossed hundreds of unnecessary kilometers during the final months of the war. Tailors shorten sleeves, replace collars, and transform military blankets into practical winter coats. Blacksmiths straighten bent tools instead of forging new ones. Carpenters repair chairs whose owners would once have replaced them without hesitation. Every trade has become less concerned with producing fresh goods than with extending the lives of objects already worn by years of use. Their work slows the relentless consumption of scarce resources while quietly restoring confidence that broken things need not always remain broken. The railway stations offer another measure of cautious recovery. Tracks remain incomplete in many places, and locomotives frequently arrive late after negotiating damaged bridges and temporary repairs. Yet each train that pulls slowly into the platform carries more than passengers. It brings sacks of grain, parcels of medicine, letters delayed for months, newspapers printed under new authorities, and sometimes relatives whose arrival had almost ceased to be expected. Station masters continue writing schedules that often change before the ink has dried, but the very act of maintaining a timetable suggests that the future may once again become something people can organize rather than simply endure. Letters regain an importance difficult to overstate. During the war, correspondence often carried fear because every envelope might announce injury, disappearance, or death. Now each letter offers the possibility of reunion or simple confirmation that someone remains alive. Families gather around kitchen tables while a single page is read several times, studying familiar handwriting as carefully as the words themselves. Addresses are copied into notebooks already crowded with names of refugee camps, hospitals, military authorities, and temporary shelters. The postal system functions imperfectly, but every successful delivery quietly strengthens invisible threads stretching across a country whose people have become widely scattered. As the afternoon lengthens toward evening, gardens receive attention once reserved for leisure rather than necessity. Hands loosen compacted earth with borrowed spades. Compost is spread carefully because commercial fertilizers remain unavailable. Fruit trees neglected during the final years of war are pruned with patient optimism, despite knowing that seasons cannot be hurried by determination alone. The work is remarkably ordinary. It would have attracted little notice before the conflict. Now its very ordinariness feels significant. To plant something that will not be harvested for many months requires confidence that life will continue long enough for the harvest to matter. When shadows begin stretching across the repaired paths winding through the rubble, people gradually return home carrying the visible results of another unremarkable day. A bucket filled with clean water. A bundle of salvaged timber. A loaf of coarse bread. A repaired bicycle wheel. A school exercise book carefully protected beneath a child's arm. None of these objects changes history. Together, however, they reveal something quieter and perhaps more enduring. A society does not begin again through grand declarations alone. It begins when enough ordinary days accumulate that tomorrow no longer feels entirely unknown, and the smallest routines slowly become the framework upon which hope can rest without needing to announce itself. Offices without certainty. The buildings themselves appear strangely unchanged. Many municipal offices escaped the worst of the bombing not because they were unimportant, but because fortune had favored one district over another. Stone staircases remain worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Brass handles still carry the polish left by thousands of hands. Wooden counters continue separating clerks from visitors exactly as they had before the war. Yet the familiarity proves deceptive. The rooms still exist. The systems that once animated them do not. Files have been scattered, cabinets emptied, officials dismissed, and entire chains of authority quietly dissolved. A building may survive intact while the institution housed within it has vanished almost completely. Each morning, people gather outside these offices long before the doors open. They arrive carrying folded papers protected inside worn envelopes, ration books tucked carefully into coat pockets, handwritten certificates, faded identity cards, or simply questions for which no document yet exists. Few know exactly which office now holds responsibility for any particular matter. The answers often depend upon which occupying authority governs the district, which employees have returned to work, and which regulations were introduced only days before. Waiting becomes less about impatience than about accepting that certainty itself has become a scarce resource. Inside, clerks sit behind desks assembled from surviving furniture, surrounded by stacks of forms that rarely match one another. Some bear the insignia of institutions that no longer exist. Others have been printed hurriedly under new administrations, their language reflecting unfamiliar priorities. Typewriters continue striking the same measured rhythm heard before the surrender, yet the information entering each page belongs to an entirely different world. Occupations, addresses, family records, food allocations, housing assignments, travel permissions, missing relatives, displaced persons, returning prisoners, all pass beneath the careful fingers of men and women who understand that a single line entered incorrectly may alter another family's already uncertain future. You observe how bureaucracy changes when almost everyone seeking assistance carries some form of loss. The questions asked across the counters are remarkably ordinary in their wording. Where did you last live? When were you born? Can anyone confirm your identity? Do you possess documents proving ownership? Yet each answer often unfolds into stories that no official form can comfortably contain. A house no longer exists, though the family still remembers its address. A marriage certificate disappeared beneath rubble together with the cabinet where it had been stored. A child cannot accurately recall the village where grandparents once lived because too many journeys have intervened. The paperwork remains methodical. Human experience rarely does. For many civilians, identity itself has become unexpectedly complicated. Years of evacuation, military service, forced labor, imprisonment, and displacement have left countless people living far from the places where records were originally kept. Children arrive accompanied by relatives who possess only fragments of their histories. Elderly parents search for sons whose military units dissolved somewhere beyond Germany's eastern borders. Women attempting to register households often know the names of missing husbands but cannot honestly say whether they should be listed as alive, dead, or simply absent. Every category offered by official forms feels incomplete when measured against lived experience. Beyond the offices, another administrative world quietly takes shape. Bulletin boards fixed outside churches, railway stations, schools, and municipal buildings become some of the busiest places in the city despite containing little movement themselves. Hundreds of handwritten notices overlap one another in careful layers. Some seek missing relatives. Others announce temporary employment clearing streets or repairing railways. Lists identify recently located prisoners or hospitals caring for the wounded. Families leave addresses where letters might reach them if anyone should ask. People linger before these boards for long periods, reading every page slowly, hoping to discover a familiar surname among the countless unfamiliar ones. The act of reading acquires a new emotional weight. Eyes move patiently down columns of names, stopping briefly whenever memory stirs. Sometimes relief arrives with astonishing simplicity. A brother has been registered in another district. A cousin is recovering in a military hospital. A daughter evacuated months earlier has finally written through a relief organization. More often, however, the boards offer no answer. People continue reading until they reach the final page, then quietly begin again from the top as though another careful examination might reveal something overlooked during the first attempt. Occupation authorities establish their own offices nearby, though their presence differs from town to town. Uniforms vary according to which allied nation administers the region. Languages heard in the streets change accordingly. Notices appear in both German and the language of the occupying forces. Curfews, travel regulations, food distribution schedules, and administrative instructions gradually fill walls already crowded with older announcements. Civilians learn that ordinary errands now frequently require unfamiliar permissions. A journey that once involved nothing more than boarding a train may now demand written authorization, identity verification, and patient explanation before travel becomes possible. Yet even within this expanding web of regulations, moments of quiet humanity persist. A clerk recognizes an elderly widow who has returned for the third consecutive week seeking information about a missing son and gently sets aside a newly arrived list before officially opening the office. A translator pauses to explain complicated instructions more slowly than regulations strictly require. Two strangers waiting in line compare addresses and discover they once lived only streets apart before the bombing scattered their neighborhoods. Institutions begin functioning again not solely because rules are established, but because individuals quietly choose patience within systems still learning how to stand. As the weeks lengthen into months, the queues outside municipal buildings become less frantic, though they do not become shorter. The nature of the questions slowly changes. At first, almost everyone had come seeking immediate necessities: food, shelter, confirmation that someone had survived. Now more complicated concerns begin quietly replacing those urgent demands. Property boundaries must somehow be reconstructed where entire streets have disappeared beneath rubble. Businesses hope to reopen but require permits from administrations that are themselves still being assembled. Schools seek teachers whose qualifications must be confirmed despite records scattered across several provinces. Everyday life begins asking administrative questions that no emergency office had originally been designed to answer. Inside the registry rooms, shelves gradually fill once more with folders tied neatly in string. The paper is often coarse, the ink uneven, and the handwriting occasionally hurried. Yet each completed file represents an attempt to return order to lives that have been forced into disorder. Clerks develop remarkable patience for incomplete information. They learn to compare fragments rather than finished records, matching remembered addresses with surviving maps, family names with parish registers, military numbers with lists arriving from distant authorities. Their work resembles careful restoration more than ordinary administration, each document reconstructed from pieces that have somehow survived the collapse. You notice how often conversations begin with apology. Visitors apologize for possessing damaged papers. Clerks apologize for lacking definite answers. Interpreters apologize when a precise word cannot easily cross from one language into another. The apologies are sincere but unnecessary. Nearly everyone entering these offices understands that certainty has become something rebuilt rather than assumed. Frustration certainly exists, yet it is tempered by the quiet recognition that those seated behind the desks inhabit the same uncertain world as those standing before them. Housing becomes one of the most persistent concerns. Entire apartment blocks no longer exist, while surviving buildings shelter far more families than they had ever been intended to accommodate. Municipal officials walk through neighborhoods carrying notebooks rather than measuring instruments, recording which rooms remain habitable, which staircases require repair, and how many people now occupy homes designed for half their number. Spare bedrooms disappear beneath temporary partitions fashioned from blankets or salvaged timber. Kitchens become shared spaces between families who had never previously met. Privacy narrows considerably, requiring patience that cannot be legislated but must instead be practiced every day. For many households, strangers gradually become familiar companions. A widow from one district may now prepare meals beside a family displaced from another region altogether. Children who spoke with unfamiliar accents only weeks earlier begin playing together in courtyards where no one asks who originally belonged there. Small disagreements naturally arise over firewood, cooking times, washing schedules, or the use of precious storage space. Yet cooperation often proves stronger than conflict, not because hardship makes people naturally kinder, but because practical necessity quietly rewards compromise. Shared roofs encourage shared routines. Beyond the towns, the countryside experiences its own administrative transformation. Farmers meet officials attempting to calculate harvests without reliable machinery, livestock inventories, or complete labor forces. Fields that had once been carefully documented must now be inspected almost from the beginning. Seeds are distributed according to uncertain estimates. Horses replace tractors where fuel remains unavailable. Bridges damaged during the final months of fighting continue limiting transport, forcing villages to rely upon local production more heavily than before. The paperwork accompanying each harvest carries unusual importance because every successful crop supports not merely one community but several neighboring ones still struggling to restore regular supply lines. Occupation governments likewise continue adapting their own procedures. Regulations introduced during the first weeks are revised as circumstances change. Some restrictions become less severe, while others tighten unexpectedly after new political concerns emerge. Civilians gradually learn that rules are no longer fixed monuments but living arrangements, altered whenever conditions require. Notice boards continue filling with amended instructions, revised travel permits, altered ration schedules, and announcements replacing those posted only days earlier. Reading public notices becomes part of ordinary routine in much the same way previous generations had once consulted newspapers or railway timetables. Amid this administrative uncertainty, letters of recommendation, personal introductions, and neighborhood reputation acquire renewed significance. A local priest confirms that a family has indeed lived nearby for many years. A former employer writes carefully that an apprentice possesses the necessary skills to repair machinery. School teachers identify children whose official records have vanished. In countless small ways, memory begins supplementing bureaucracy. Communities become living archives while official archives slowly rebuild themselves. The trust placed in familiar faces often carries as much practical value as the stamps and signatures gradually returning to official documents. Toward evening, when offices finally close their doors, clerks remain behind for a few quiet moments arranging papers into careful stacks before extinguishing lamps one by one. Outside, the lines have disappeared, leaving only worn footprints across the steps and faint impressions where people waited patiently throughout the day. Tomorrow those footsteps will return. New questions will replace those answered today. Additional files will fill another shelf. More names will be copied into ledgers whose pages seek, line by line, to restore a sense of continuity that war had almost erased. The work progresses slowly enough that no single afternoon reveals dramatic change. Yet taken together, these countless hours spent recording births, confirming identities, assigning housing, issuing permits, and searching for the missing accomplish something quietly profound. They transform survival into society. Long before buildings are fully rebuilt, institutions begin recovering their patient heartbeat, not through grand declarations but through ordinary desks, worn typewriters, careful handwriting, and people willing to believe that even a simple piece of paper can help anchor a life that has drifted too long without certainty. Faces returning through the crowd. The railway platforms never become truly quiet. Even on afternoons when only a handful of trains arrive, people continue gathering beneath station clocks whose hands once again divide the day into recognizable hours. They wait without obvious impatience, standing beside worn suitcases, bicycles, handcarts, or nothing at all. Some hold small photographs softened by repeated handling. Others carry folded letters containing dates, camp names, military unit numbers, or rumors gathered from travelers who had crossed several occupation zones before reaching the city. Every arriving train represents possibility. Every departing one carries someone else's unanswered questions farther down the line. The locomotives themselves bear visible evidence of the years they have endured. Paint has faded beneath soot and weather. Replacement parts differ slightly from the originals they substitute. Windows have been repaired with panes that never quite match. Their journeys remain slower than before the war, interrupted by temporary bridges, damaged signals, and stretches of track still awaiting reconstruction. Yet each successful arrival quietly restores confidence that distance, once made nearly impossible by conflict, can again be crossed through patience rather than desperation. Passengers step carefully onto unfamiliar platforms carrying lives compressed into remarkably few possessions. A blanket rolled tightly around spare clothing. A cooking pot suspended from a length of rope. A suitcase whose corners have been repaired with thin strips of metal salvaged from somewhere along the journey. Many pause before moving farther, allowing their eyes to search the waiting crowd with extraordinary concentration. Recognition has become a fragile event. Faces remembered from years earlier have aged quickly beneath hunger, imprisonment, displacement, or relentless uncertainty. Hair has turned grey sooner than expected. Children have grown beyond easy identification. Uniforms have disappeared beneath borrowed civilian coats. Sometimes two people pass one another without realizing that they once shared a home. You notice that reunions rarely resemble celebration. More often they begin in stillness. Someone recognizes the particular way another person stands before recognizing the face itself. A mother reaches cautiously toward an adult son whose features have altered enough to invite hesitation. Brothers study one another for a brief moment, silently accounting for the years that separate memory from the present. Then movement returns. Hands meet shoulders. Suitcases fall forgotten onto the platform. No dramatic speeches are necessary because the simple fact of standing together again contains more meaning than language easily carries. Not every arrival brings joy uncomplicated by uncertainty. Former prisoners return carrying illnesses that require months of recovery. Soldiers released from captivity step into neighborhoods transformed almost beyond recognition, searching for streets renamed by destruction rather than official decree. Some discover that homes no longer exist. Others learn that relatives relocated months earlier, leaving only forwarding addresses written carefully upon scraps of paper. Home itself has become something that often requires another journey before it can finally be reached. Across Germany, millions continue moving at the same time. Refugees travel westward from territories no longer under German administration. Families separated during evacuation attempt to reverse journeys begun years earlier under entirely different circumstances. Children accompanied by relief organizations search for surviving relatives through networks of churches, municipal offices, and humanitarian agencies patiently comparing names against lists compiled in dozens of towns. Movement remains one of the defining conditions of post-war life, yet it is gradually changing in character. These travelers no longer flee approaching armies. They search for permanence. For those waiting at home, preparation becomes its own quiet ritual. Spare blankets are aired beside open windows. A bed is assembled from salvaged timber because someone may need it tomorrow. The final portion of preserved fruit is carefully reserved rather than eaten because it should greet a returning daughter rather than disappear during another ordinary supper. Conversations frequently begin with the same hopeful phrase. Perhaps this week. Perhaps the next train. Perhaps someone arriving from another district will finally bring reliable news. Hope is rarely loud. It survives through repetition instead. You begin to understand that waiting alters the shape of domestic life even when nothing outwardly appears different. A coat continues hanging behind the kitchen door because its owner may still return. A favorite cup remains carefully protected despite shortages that would justify using every available possession. Family photographs are dusted gently, not as memorials but as practical aids for memory, preserving expressions that passing years threaten to blur. The household exists simultaneously in two different times: the present, where practical survival demands constant attention, and an imagined future where absent voices might once again join the evening meal. Elsewhere, relief organizations quietly expand their work beyond emergency assistance. Volunteers sort letters arriving from distant camps. Nurses accompany weakened former prisoners during the final stages of long journeys home. Translators help reconnect families divided by language as well as geography after years spent across occupied Europe. Railway employees become unexpectedly skilled at answering questions that possess no timetable. They know which trains usually carry returning prisoners, which routes remain unreliable, and which stations display the newest lists of identified survivors. Information itself becomes a form of humanitarian aid, offered carefully because even uncertain guidance may spare someone days of unnecessary travel. As another train slowly disappears beyond the station, the platform empties only briefly before new arrivals replace those who have departed. The rhythm continues day after day, each journey quietly reshaping families whose histories had been scattered across a continent. Some reunions occur. Others are postponed. Many never come at all. Yet the waiting persists, sustained by the simple conviction that as long as trains continue arriving, the distance between absence and return has not yet become impossible to cross. Away from the stations, the return home often unfolds much more quietly than the journey itself. There is no crowd waiting beside every doorway, no formal welcome arranged by neighbors who are themselves occupied with rebuilding their own lives. More often, someone appears at the end of a familiar street carrying a single suitcase or military blanket, walking slowly because certainty weakens with every step closer to the house. Memory insists that everything should appear unchanged. The eye immediately discovers otherwise. A favorite tree has been cut for firewood. The neighboring building has vanished entirely. A garden gate leans slightly where its hinges were hastily repaired. Home has survived, perhaps, but it has continued living without those now returning to it. The moment of arrival is frequently marked by hesitation rather than movement. A former prisoner pauses outside a doorway that once required no thought before entering. A soldier released from captivity removes his cap almost unconsciously before knocking, uncertain who might answer. Inside, footsteps approach with equal caution. Those who have remained behind have also spent years imagining this moment, rehearsing countless possibilities until imagination itself has become unreliable. When the door finally opens, recognition often arrives in stages. Familiar eyes appear before the rest of the face is fully understood. A familiar voice speaks a single name. Only then does the distance created by years begin, slowly, to narrow. The embrace itself cannot restore what time has altered. Children who were infants when fathers departed now cling shyly to mothers' skirts, uncertain why this thin, weathered stranger has suddenly become the center of everyone's attention. Parents discover that sons have become middle-aged men while absent, their youthful confidence replaced by quieter expressions shaped through years of captivity or relentless movement across Europe. Husbands and wives search one another's faces for traces of the people memory has carefully preserved, finding instead individuals who carry experiences too large to explain during a single afternoon. Love remains recognizable. Familiarity must patiently grow again. You watch ordinary domestic routines adjust almost imperceptibly around these returns. Another chair is placed beside the kitchen table after standing empty for years. Portions are divided differently because one more person now shares the evening meal. A blanket is unfolded in a room already crowded with improvised furniture. Conversations continue late into the evening, though they often avoid the subjects outsiders imagine would naturally come first. Practical questions gently lead the way. Are your feet healing? Did you eat during the journey? Can your coat be repaired? Which route did you travel? The deeper stories remain waiting, not because they are forgotten, but because ordinary care must precede extraordinary memory. For many families, silence becomes an unexpected companion. Those returning from prisoner of war camps, forced labor, or prolonged displacement frequently discover that language struggles to describe years lived under conditions so unlike ordinary civilian existence. Equally, those who remained at home possess their own experiences of bombing, hunger, loss, and uncertainty that cannot easily be compressed into conversation. Around countless supper tables, pauses appear not from discomfort alone but from mutual consideration. Each person senses that the others carry burdens whose full weight should not yet be disturbed. Shared presence gradually becomes more valuable than immediate explanation. Not every homecoming ends at the intended address. Some returning civilians discover strangers occupying their former apartments through official housing assignments made during the chaos of the preceding months. Others arrive to learn that surviving relatives have relocated elsewhere in search of work or shelter. Municipal offices once again become destinations, this time not merely for registration but for tracing families whose journeys continued even after the fighting ceased. A homecoming sometimes becomes another search, quieter than those undertaken during the war yet equally dependent upon patience, paperwork, and the willingness of strangers to offer directions or fragments of information. The neighborhoods themselves slowly absorb these returning lives. Familiar faces reappear in breadlines, at church services, beside communal wells, or helping clear debris from streets they once walked as children. Neighbors greet one another with careful warmth, asking simple questions while respecting answers that remain brief. Stories circulate gradually rather than all at once. Someone had spent 2 years repairing railways far to the east. Another survived imprisonment by teaching languages to fellow prisoners. A third had crossed several countries on foot before finally reaching the city. None of these histories is announced publicly. They spread gently through ordinary conversation, becoming part of the shared memory of the street rather than extraordinary tales demanding attention. Children observe these changes with particular curiosity. They accept new family routines more quickly than adults, adapting to unfamiliar fathers, older brothers, aunts, or grandparents returning after long absences. Their questions remain wonderfully direct. Why is grandfather so thin? Why does uncle wake before dawn every morning? Why does father always save pieces of bread until the meal has ended? Adults answer as carefully as they can, though many explanations remain incomplete. Habits formed during years of deprivation persist long after necessity has eased, quietly revealing that the body remembers hardship long after the immediate danger has passed. As evening settles over the city once more, lights begin appearing behind patched windows where families now gather in slightly larger numbers than they had only weeks before. Some chairs remain painfully empty. Others have unexpectedly been filled again. The balance changes from house to house, never evenly, never completely. Yet with every reunion, however modest or imperfect, another small thread is woven back into the fabric of community. Outside, trains continue arriving beneath the darkening sky, carrying tomorrow's possibilities toward waiting platforms. Inside countless homes, ordinary conversation slowly grows more natural around people who had once seemed almost lost to memory. The work of rebuilding families proves gentler than rebuilding cities and no less demanding. It asks not for bricks or timber but for patience, quiet attention, and the willingness to believe that even lives separated by war can, little by little, learn the shape of one another again. Living beneath new authorities. The uniforms are different. For many civilians, that simple observation becomes one of the clearest signs that the country has entered a new chapter. The streets remain familiar, the churches still ring the same bells when their towers have survived, and the rivers continue following courses unchanged by politics or war. Yet the figures directing traffic, guarding bridges, occupying government buildings, or speaking outside municipal offices now belong to armies that only weeks earlier had approached from distant horizons. Their languages drift through marketplaces and railway stations, mixing with German conversations in ways that would once have seemed almost unimaginable. The presence of occupation is often less dramatic than later memory suggests. It is encountered not only in military vehicles or official proclamations, but in the ordinary adjustments that gradually reshape everyday life. New notices appear beside old ones. Curfews establish different rhythms for evening streets. Travel between neighboring districts requires permissions unfamiliar to those who had once moved freely across provincial boundaries. Shops reopen under revised regulations. Newspapers return carrying voices and priorities that differ markedly from those read before the surrender. Change arrives less like a single event than like weather slowly altering an entire landscape. You begin to notice how carefully civilians observe these new authorities. Curiosity accompanies caution. Children sometimes pause to watch foreign soldiers repairing a bridge or distributing supplies, fascinated by unfamiliar accents, equipment, and uniforms. Adults watch more quietly, measuring behavior rather than appearance. Does this officer speak patiently with local officials? Are civilians treated respectfully at checkpoints? Will today's regulations resemble tomorrow's, or will they change once again? Trust is no longer assumed. It develops gradually through repeated encounters, just as suspicion had once done during the years of war. Municipal governments now exist within a framework they do not entirely control. Local administrators continue organizing rubbish collection, housing assignments, school reopening, and food distribution. Yet many decisions require approval from occupation authorities whose priorities extend far beyond individual neighborhoods. Meetings become exercises in translation as much as administration. Maps are spread across tables already crowded with ration reports and reconstruction plans. Interpreters move carefully between languages, searching not only for equivalent words but for shared understanding. Every successful conversation quietly demonstrates that cooperation, though often slow, remains possible even after prolonged conflict. In the marketplaces, occupation is experienced through practical realities rather than political theory. New currencies circulate alongside old ones in confusing combinations depending upon region and circumstance. Imported supplies occasionally appear among locally produced goods, attracting curious attention before quickly becoming part of ordinary commerce. Relief shipments provide flour, powdered milk, medical equipment, and clothing that had been impossible to obtain only months earlier. Their arrival does not eliminate shortages, but it slightly alters the calculations families make while preparing meals or planning for another winter. The atmosphere surrounding public conversation changes as well. Subjects once discussed openly disappear from casual speech, replaced by cautious observation of the present. People speak readily about harvests, damaged roads, school timetables, and ration allocations. Other topics are approached more carefully, often only among trusted friends or family members. Years of dictatorship followed by military collapse have taught many civilians that political certainty can vanish remarkably quickly. Silence, once enforced from above, now often survives as personal habit. You observe this restraint in cafes slowly reopening behind repaired windows. Tables once crowded with lively debate now host quieter exchanges. A carpenter discusses where to find usable timber. Two mothers compare ration schedules between neighboring districts. Railway workers exchange information about repaired lines farther north. When conversations drift toward recent history, voices naturally soften. Not because memory has faded, but because memory remains close enough to demand careful handling. Everyone has lived through the same years. Very few have lived through them in exactly the same way. Occupation soldiers likewise begin settling into routines that gradually replace the extraordinary circumstances of military victory. Patrols follow predictable routes. Engineers supervise bridge repairs alongside local laborists. Medical personnel cooperate with German hospitals still struggling through shortages of equipment and trained staff. Young soldiers write letters home from barracks established inside schools, administrative buildings, or former military installations. They too experience ordinary days shaped increasingly by repetition rather than combat, though the uniforms they wear continually remind civilians that peace has arrived under foreign authority rather than independent recovery. Throughout these encounters, practical cooperation quietly becomes more common than dramatic confrontation. A bridge cannot be reopened through ideology alone. A water main does not distinguish between victor and defeated when it bursts beneath a damaged street. Disease threatens occupying troops and local civilians with equal indifference. Shared problems encourage shared labor, even when mutual understanding remains incomplete. Progress often begins not with agreement about the past, but with recognition that tomorrow's clean water, repaired railway, or functioning hospital serves everyone living within the same wounded landscape. As evening approaches, the foreign vehicles gradually withdraw toward their barracks while local residents return to homes where candles and modest fires once again illuminate repaired rooms. The uniforms remain visible, yet they have become part of the daily scenery rather than constant interruptions to it. Occupation no longer feels entirely temporary, though neither does it feel permanent. It has become another condition through which ordinary life must quietly learn to continue, adding one more layer to the complicated work of beginning again. As the seasons begin their slow movement beyond the first post-war summer, occupation becomes increasingly woven into the ordinary fabric of daily existence. What had first appeared unusual gradually acquires the quiet familiarity that accompanies repetition. Children no longer stop to stare each time a military convoy passes through the town. Shopkeepers instinctively recognize the hours when checkpoints become busiest. Railway clerks learn which travel permits require additional signatures before tickets may be issued. The extraordinary continues to exist, but it settles into routine, becoming another condition that shapes the rhythm of civilian life rather than interrupting it. Administrative notices multiply across public buildings, their layers revealing how quickly circumstances continue evolving. One announcement revises food distribution schedules. Another explains changes to travel restrictions between occupation zones. A third lists temporary regulations governing businesses hoping to reopen. Older notices are removed, replaced, amended, or quietly forgotten as new instructions arrive. Walls that once displayed political slogans now carry practical information instead, their purpose shifting from persuasion to administration. Reading public notices becomes as ordinary as checking the weather, because tomorrow's routine may depend upon a sheet of paper pinned carefully to a municipal notice board. For teachers, priests, doctors, and local officials, each working day requires careful navigation between continuity and change. Schools attempt to restore familiar lessons while adapting to entirely revised educational expectations. Libraries quietly examine their shelves, deciding which books remain, which disappear, and which new volumes gradually take their place. Churches continue marking baptisms, weddings, and funerals with rituals that have endured for generations. Yet even these ceremonies occur within communities profoundly altered by loss and displacement. Hospitals treat illnesses that bear little connection to battle, though malnutrition, exhaustion, and years of deprivation continue shaping the health of many patients long after the fighting has ceased. You notice that ordinary conversations increasingly concern the future rather than the immediate emergency. Farmers discuss next year's seed rather than this week's harvest. Shopkeepers wonder whether suppliers might soon resume regular deliveries instead of relying upon unpredictable exchanges. Parents begin asking teachers about examinations, apprenticeships, and possibilities for older children who have already lost years of education. Such questions would have seemed almost luxurious during the final months of the war. Now they quietly reveal a society beginning to measure time in seasons and years once again instead of merely surviving from one day to the next. Yet the past refuses to withdraw entirely into memory. Across towns and villages, occupation authorities continue the patient work of investigating former institutions, organizations, and individuals connected to the previous regime. Interviews are conducted in offices where clerks record statements with the same measured attention they devote to housing applications or food allocations. Some residents are required to complete detailed questionnaires about wartime activities, employment, and political affiliations. Others are called to testify regarding neighbors, colleagues, or former officials whose actions have become subjects of official examination. The process unfolds slowly, often unevenly, and rarely with the clarity later generations might expect. For ordinary civilians, these investigations introduce another layer of uncertainty into already complicated lives. A schoolmaster wonders whether he will be permitted to continue teaching. A municipal employee waits months before learning whether he may return permanently to his former duties. Business owners hope to reopen workshops while awaiting decisions from authorities reviewing records that survived only in fragments. Families discover that conversations about the recent past require new caution, not merely because memories remain painful, but because memory itself has acquired administrative significance. Everyday life now exists alongside the careful examination of everything that preceded it. You observe that neighborhoods respond differently to this quiet scrutiny. In some streets, people speak openly about those who disappeared into prisons, camps, or forced labor, sharing recollections that had long remained unspoken. Elsewhere, silence persists more stubbornly. Not every family possesses the same experiences. Not every household carries the same burdens of memory. Many simply wish to continue rebuilding roofs, repairing bicycles, tending gardens, and raising children without reopening questions they scarcely know how to answer. The desire for ordinary life and the obligation to confront the past begin existing side by side, neither entirely replacing the other. Occupation soldiers also experience subtle changes in perspective. The first months had required establishing order, restoring essential services, and responding to immediate humanitarian needs. Now many find themselves participating in quieter forms of administration. They supervise rebuilding projects, inspect infrastructure, coordinate supply deliveries, or assist local officials navigating unfamiliar regulations. Relationships between occupiers and civilians remain shaped by the recent conflict, yet repeated cooperation over practical concerns gradually replaces the constant tension of initial encounters. Familiar faces appear across desks, construction sites, hospitals, and railway depots until recognition begins softening what had once been complete unfamiliarity. As autumn approaches, market stalls display slightly larger harvests than those of the previous year. Schoolyards echo with steadier routines. Railway timetables become a little more dependable, though delays remain common enough to inspire little complaint. Evenings arrive earlier now, encouraging families to gather around stoves repaired during the summer months. Candles still burn where electricity has not fully returned, but their light falls upon homes that feel marginally less temporary than they did only a season before. Recovery remains incomplete in every direction one chooses to look, yet incompleteness itself has become something people know how to inhabit. When darkness settles across the towns, foreign sentries continue their quiet patrols while local residents close shutters against the cooling air. The presence of occupation has not disappeared. It has instead become one of many realities woven into the texture of post-war existence. Alongside repaired bridges, reopened schools, shared gardens, crowded homes, and slowly recovering institutions, it forms part of a landscape where history has not yet finished reshaping ordinary lives. Peace, it becomes increasingly clear, is not simply the absence of war. It is the patient coexistence of memory, responsibility, adaptation, and the countless unnoticed routines through which an entire society gradually learns how to move forward without pretending that it has ever truly returned to where it once began. The weight of quiet memory. By the second year after the surrender, many of the outward signs of emergency have begun to soften. The piles of rubble are still immense, yet narrower streets have been cleared into usable paths. Temporary roofs have become slightly more permanent. Markets open according to dependable hours. Schools expect children each morning without wondering whether another interruption will prevent lessons from continuing. Trains still arrive late more often than not, but they arrive with enough regularity that watches are once again consulted before leaving home. From a distance, the country appears to be rediscovering its ordinary shape. Closer observation tells a quieter story. Recovery has altered the appearance of daily life far more quickly than it has altered the memories carried within it. Morning begins much as it did months before. Fires are lit. Bread is sliced carefully across kitchen tables worn smooth by decades of family use. Children prepare satchels before leaving for school, pausing briefly while mothers straighten collars or remind them to return before dusk. Shopkeepers lift shutters. Farmers inspect fields whose harvests now promise something slightly more generous than those of the previous year. The routines have become reassuring precisely because they ask so little explanation. Ordinary labor allows the mind to rest upon familiar movements rather than difficult recollections. Yet memory possesses its own quiet timetable. It appears unexpectedly while peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink because a particular smell recalls another winter when vegetables had been almost impossible to find. It returns while sweeping dust from a repaired floor because the motion resembles clearing broken glass after an air raid years earlier. A train whistle drifting across the evening air reminds someone of crowded freight wagons moving endlessly toward destinations no passenger had chosen. No anniversary is required. Memory enters through ordinary sensations, attaching itself to sounds, weather, and gestures so common that avoiding them becomes impossible. You begin to notice how rarely these moments interrupt the work itself. Hands continue kneading bread while thoughts wander elsewhere. Laundry is folded carefully even as the mind revisits a station platform where someone never returned. A carpenter planes fresh timber into smooth boards while remembering beams blackened by fire. The body has learned that survival depends upon continuing the task before it, even when memory quietly unfolds beside it. Daily life becomes broad enough to contain both realities at once. Across neighborhoods, cemeteries slowly change their appearance. During the immediate aftermath of the war, many graves had been temporary, marked hurriedly with wooden crosses fashioned from whatever material could be found. Now families return carrying proper stone markers when circumstances allow. Flowers begin appearing more regularly, not only on public days of remembrance but during ordinary afternoons when someone simply decides the grave should not stand unattended another week. Children accompany parents who gently explain names carved into weathered stone, introducing relatives they themselves barely remember except through photographs and stories repeated around evening tables. For many households, photographs acquire increasing importance as the years pass. Frames rescued from damaged homes are repaired and hung once again upon newly plastered walls. Albums containing pictures softened by smoke, moisture, or hurried evacuation become treasured possessions consulted during birthdays, weddings, and quiet Sunday afternoons. Faces captured before the war smile with remarkable ease, unaware of everything history still held before them. Younger children study these photographs with curious attention, learning family histories through expressions frozen long before they themselves were born. The conversations surrounding such images are careful rather than dramatic. Someone remembers how an uncle always whistled while repairing bicycles. A grandmother laughs quietly about a wedding dress sewn from fabric bought before shortages changed everything. An older brother recalls swimming in a river whose bridge no longer exists. These stories seldom begin with the war. They begin with ordinary life because that is how those being remembered had actually lived. Conflict occupies only part of their histories. Families instinctively understand that remembrance becomes gentler when people are first restored as neighbors, parents, musicians, students, gardeners, or children rather than only as victims or soldiers. You observe the same quiet transformation beyond individual homes. Streets rebuilt during the previous year gradually acquire gardens again. Fruit trees planted by earlier generations survive beside newly constructed houses whose bricks still appear brighter than those surrounding them. Church bells ring over districts where entirely new apartment blocks rise beside buildings centuries older. Reconstruction no longer feels temporary. It has become the accepted condition of the landscape itself. Even so, certain empty spaces remain untouched. Not every lot is rebuilt immediately. Some continue serving as modest parks, vegetable gardens, or open fields where children play football beneath skies once filled with aircraft. Visitors unfamiliar with the city might assume these open places were intentional features of thoughtful urban planning. Residents know differently. They remember the houses that once stood there, the shops that sold fresh bread before dawn, the apartments whose windows overlooked streets now altered beyond recognition. The absence becomes woven into everyday geography, visible only to those whose memories still quietly complete the missing walls. As evening gathers across the rebuilt neighborhoods, light falls differently than it had during the years of conflict. Windows glow not because blackout curtains have been carefully parted, but because families once again allow warm lamplight to reach the street without fear that it will invite danger from the sky. Curtains remain open a little longer. Doors stand ajar while cooler air drifts through kitchens carrying the scent of soup, fresh bread, damp earth after rain, or timber newly cut for repairs still underway somewhere nearby. The sounds of ordinary domestic life become more confident with each passing season. Yet beneath them there remains a quieter layer of listening that many adults never entirely abandon. It is not unusual for someone to pause at the sound of an unexpected engine before remembering that aircraft now cross the sky for reasons other than war. A sudden bang from a construction site may briefly still a conversation before everyone realizes that another damaged wall has been safely demolished to make room for new foundations. These moments grow less frequent as time passes, yet they reveal how deeply experience has settled into the body. Memory often arrives before reason has time to reassure it. The heart responds first. Understanding follows a moment later. You watch these small reactions with the same patience that has guided every stage of recovery. They are rarely discussed openly because they require no explanation among those who lived through the same years. A woman pauses while hanging laundry after hearing distant thunder. An elderly man instinctively looks toward the horizon when church bells ring in unusual succession. Children notice these brief hesitations without fully understanding them, accepting them as naturally as they accept the routines of school, family meals, or tending a garden. In this way, experience passes quietly between generations, not only through stories but through gestures so ordinary they almost escape notice. Community gatherings slowly begin reclaiming their place within the calendar. Harvest festivals return in villages where enough grain has finally been gathered to justify modest celebration. Choirs sing once more in parish halls whose roofs were repaired by volunteers over several summers. Markets grow busier during autumn as preserves, apples, root vegetables, and homemade goods fill wooden stalls that had stood nearly empty in the difficult years immediately after the surrender. These occasions do not erase grief. Rather, they remind people that celebration itself is an ordinary human skill requiring practice after long periods of interruption. For many who attend these gatherings, joy feels quieter than it once might have done. Laughter comes readily, yet it rarely overwhelms the conversation surrounding it. People have learned to appreciate abundance without assuming it will always remain. A table carrying fresh bread, cheese, preserves, and warm potatoes represents more than a pleasant meal. It reflects seasons of patient cultivation, repaired roads, functioning mills, reliable transport, and neighbors who have gradually rebuilt enough trust to trade with one another again. Prosperity, even in its modest early form, is understood not as fortune alone but as the accumulated result of countless ordinary decisions repeated faithfully over time. You begin to recognize another subtle transformation taking place within these communities. During the immediate aftermath of the war, nearly every conversation had revolved around absence, who had not returned, which building had been lost, what resource remained unavailable. Now conversations increasingly concern presence. Which child has begun an apprenticeship? Which family has finally moved into a repaired home? Whose orchard produced fruit again this year? Which bridge reopened last month? The questions themselves reveal the direction in which memory is gradually turning. Loss remains part of every household, yet life has quietly resumed, creating new stories alongside the old ones. Teachers witness this change perhaps more clearly than most. Classrooms now contain children whose earliest memories belong not to wartime but to Reconstruction. They draw streets lined with houses under repair rather than burning skylines. They describe fathers working in workshops, mothers tending gardens, trains carrying passengers instead of refugees. When history lessons eventually reach the years of conflict, many students encounter them first through photographs, family recollections, and the measured voices of adults rather than through personal experience. The responsibility of memory slowly begins shifting from those who endured events to those who must learn them with honesty and care. Across the towns and villages, craftsmen continue replacing temporary repairs with lasting work. Wooden footbridges become stone crossings. Patchwork roofs give way to carefully laid tiles. Saplings planted soon after the surrender begin casting small shadows across playgrounds and churchyards. Their growth is almost imperceptible from one week to the next, yet unmistakable over the course of several years. Trees become quiet companions to memory, rooted in places where destruction once seemed permanent, reminding those who pass beneath them that endurance often expresses itself through patient growth rather than dramatic change. As dusk settles fully across the landscape, families close shutters against the evening chill and gather once more around tables that have gradually witnessed more ordinary days than extraordinary ones. The conversation moves easily between tomorrow's work, a child's lessons, the condition of the vegetable garden, a neighbor recovering from illness, and the possibility of visiting relatives next Sunday if the trains continue running on time. These subjects would have seemed almost unimaginably simple only a short while earlier. Now they form the gentle architecture of a life slowly reclaimed. Outside, the streets remain quieter than they were before the war, though no longer because silence has been imposed by fear. It is the quieter rhythm of communities learning that peace is not a single moment granted by treaties or declarations. It is something assembled day after day through familiar routines, shared labor, remembered names, and the quiet willingness to carry the past without allowing it to prevent the future from taking root beside it. Seasons that belong to children. There comes a moment in every recovering society when the calendar quietly changes its meaning. Not because new holidays are declared or old traditions abandoned, but because the passing seasons begin to belong less to memory and more to expectation. Spring is no longer remembered chiefly for the final offensives of the war. It becomes the season when orchards blossom again. Autumn is anticipated for its harvest rather than feared for another winter of shortages. Snow is measured by whether roads remain open to school children instead of whether supply columns can still reach isolated neighborhoods. The landscape itself has not changed. The relationship between people and time slowly has. Morning begins with voices that carry a different quality than those heard during the first months after surrender. Children walk towards school in small groups, their satchels repaired many times but now filled with exercise books rather than emergency provisions. They pause beside streams to watch ducks drift across quiet water or linger beneath chestnut trees gathering fallen seeds before reluctantly continuing toward classrooms where teachers have once again begun expecting punctuality rather than simply attendance. Their conversations concern arithmetic lessons, football matches, birthdays, and the first signs of snow in the nearby hills. History remains present around them, but it no longer occupies every sentence. Many adults observe these ordinary scenes with quiet attention. They notice how naturally children accept routines that had once seemed impossible to restore. The morning walk to school. Homework completed beside the kitchen lamp. Choir practice after lessons. Helping in the vegetable garden before supper. Such habits appear entirely unremarkable to the young, yet to parents and grandparents they represent achievements that required years of patient reconstruction. Every ordinary childhood quietly confirms that society has regained something more valuable than efficiency. It has recovered continuity. You begin to understand why playgrounds become unexpectedly important places within recovering towns. Swings repaired with fresh timber. Football goals assembled from salvaged beams. Sand carefully cleared of broken glass long buried beneath rubble. Adults devote long hours to these modest projects despite shortages that still affect many aspects of daily life. They do so because play announces confidence in tomorrow. A community does not build a playground unless it believes children will continue returning to it through many seasons yet to come. The sounds surrounding these spaces differ profoundly from those that had once defined the same neighborhoods. Laughter echoes where warning sirens had previously dominated the air. A whistle from a teacher organizing games replaces shouted military commands. Dogs chase sticks thrown across open fields that only a few years earlier had been crossed cautiously because unexploded ammunition remained hidden beneath the grass. Nature, children, and ordinary movement gradually reclaim places where fear had once governed every decision. Recovery often becomes audible before it is fully visible. Parents continue carrying memories that their children cannot entirely understand. A mother watches her daughter walk confidently across a bridge whose temporary replacement she herself had once crossed with hesitation while carrying water home in heavy buckets. A father observes boys climbing trees planted after the war, remembering when the same ground lay open beneath collapsed buildings. Their reflections rarely interrupt the present. Instead, they quietly deepen appreciation for moments so ordinary that younger generations accept them without question. Schools likewise continue evolving beyond emergency instruction. Libraries slowly expand. Music lessons return where instruments have survived or been repaired. Science classes receive modest collections of equipment shared carefully between pupils. Geography lessons once again describe neighboring countries as places connected by rivers, mountains, and trade rather than only by front lines and occupation zones. Education resumes its broader purpose of preparing children for futures extending well beyond immediate survival. You notice that teachers increasingly encourage curiosity instead of caution. During wartime, many questions had possessed dangerous answers. Now classrooms reward inquiry once again. Children ask why rivers follow certain valleys, how birds migrate each autumn, why leaves change color before winter, and how bridges are designed to support trains crossing wide rivers. These simple questions reveal profound change. A society confident enough to nurture curiosity has already traveled a considerable distance from one governed entirely by fear. Across farms and villages, young people begin learning trades from parents and grandparents whose own apprenticeships had been interrupted years earlier. A grandfather teaches careful pruning of apple trees planted before the First World War. A mother shows her daughter how to preserve fruit for winter using recipes remembered from her own childhood. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and millers gradually accept apprentices who know conflict largely through family stories rather than personal experience. Skills once threatened by disruption quietly pass into new hands, preserving not merely occupations but rhythms of life carried across generations. As another spring afternoon stretches gently toward evening, children drift home along roads increasingly bordered by fresh hedges, repaired fences, and gardens bright with flowers that had no practical necessity beyond simple beauty. Many pause briefly beside streams or linger in village squares where older residents sit exchanging familiar greetings. Their pace is unhurried because they assume tomorrow will resemble today in the best possible ways. That assumption, almost invisible in its ordinariness, may be one of the clearest signs that the long work of beginning again has truly taken root. As evening settles over the villages and towns, another rhythm quietly reveals itself. Windows glow with the steady light of homes preparing the final meal of the day. Schoolbooks rest beside bowls of soup. Boots left outside the door gather the dust of playgrounds rather than the mud of long journeys. A jacket hangs over the back of a chair waiting for tomorrow's walk to school. These objects possess no historical importance on their own, yet together they mark a remarkable transformation. The household has once again become a place organized around the future instead of merely responding to the present. The seasons begin shaping family life with a confidence that had been absent for many years. During spring, children help sow vegetables in gardens whose soil has gradually recovered from neglect and debris. Summer brings longer evenings spent beside rivers where fishing lines drift quietly across calm water. Autumn fills kitchens with apples, cabbage, potatoes, and preserves carefully arranged upon pantry shelves in preparation for winter. When snow finally arrives, it is watched with practical concern rather than fear. Adults still calculate whether enough firewood has been stacked beneath shelter and whether roofs will withstand another season of frost. Yet these calculations belong to the ordinary responsibilities of rural and urban life alike rather than the desperate arithmetic of wartime survival. You notice that celebrations also return with gentle confidence. Birthdays once postponed because there had been little to offer now include simple cakes baked from ingredients patiently saved over several weeks. Weddings become more frequent as young couples who had delayed marriage during the conflict quietly begin households of their own. Church festivals, harvest gatherings, school performances, and local music evenings slowly reclaim places within the calendar. None of these occasions are extravagant. Their importance lies precisely in their modesty. They remind entire communities that ordinary happiness does not require grandeur to become meaningful. For grandparents, these gatherings often carry a second layer of quiet reflection. They watch grandchildren running freely across village greens or through city parks planted where rubble once stood, noticing how naturally the young inhabit landscapes that older generations can still mentally divide into before and after. A child chasing a wooden hoop across a newly paved square sees only open space. An elderly observer remembers the collapsed buildings that once occupied the same ground. Neither perception is incorrect. They simply belong to different chapters of the same place. Across Germany, craftsmen continue leaving subtle signatures upon the recovering landscape. Stone masons replace temporary memorial markers with carefully carved headstones. Glaziers fit clear panes into windows that had long been covered with boards or patched with mismatched pieces of glass. Clockmakers restore church mechanisms that once again measure the passing hours for entire communities. Their work rarely attracts public attention because successful craftsmanship often disappears into normality. A repaired clock is valued precisely because people soon stop noticing it. Quiet competence becomes one of reconstruction's most enduring achievements. You begin to recognize that beauty itself gradually returns as a deliberate choice rather than an unnecessary luxury. Flower boxes appear beneath windows newly repaired. Public gardens receive benches where neighbors pause during evening walks. Fruit trees are planted not only because they will someday provide food, but because someone believes enough years remain ahead for the trees to mature. Painters restore faded signs above shops. Families sew curtains from whatever fabric they can spare, choosing patterns simply because they brighten a room. These decisions contribute little to survival in the immediate sense, yet they nourish something equally essential: the conviction that life deserves care beyond necessity alone. Teachers observe similar changes within their classrooms. Children's drawings begin filling with forests, rivers, animals, churches, gardens, and village streets instead of scenes shaped by destruction. Essays increasingly describe family outings, seasonal work, favorite books, or hopes for future occupations. When war appears in their schoolwork, it often does so through stories told by parents or grandparents rather than memories carried personally. The responsibility for remembering gradually shifts from experience to education, requiring patience, honesty, and restraint from those entrusted with telling the past to those who did not witness it. The natural world quietly reinforces this slow transition. Birds continue returning each spring without knowledge of human frontiers or political settlements. Rivers carry snowmelt through valleys where bridges have finally been rebuilt. Forests reclaim abandoned military positions with moss, wildflowers, and young saplings pushing patiently through rusting metal left undisturbed beneath the soil. Nature does not erase history. It surrounds it, softening harsh edges while allowing traces to remain for those who know where to look. The landscape becomes a partner in remembrance rather than its replacement. As darkness settles across another ordinary evening, families close doors against the cooling air and gather around tables that now feel comfortably familiar. Homework is finished. Tomorrow's clothes are folded neatly. Bread is wrapped carefully for breakfast. Parents discuss work, neighbors, weather, and plans for the coming weekend while children grow drowsy beside the warmth of the stove. Outside, the streets grow quiet beneath stars that shine over rebuilt homes, repaired schools, and gardens planted with confidence in seasons yet to come. The country has not forgotten what it endured. It carries those years within its streets, its families, and its silences. Yet it also carries something else now, something visible in every child who assumes that tomorrow will begin with lessons, games, familiar voices, and the reassuring rhythm of another ordinary day. In that quiet expectation lies one of the deepest forms of recovery, a future becoming so natural that it no longer needs to announce its arrival. Years pass quietly enough that they are seldom noticed while they are being lived. A wall is repaired. Then another. A generation grows taller. Trees planted beside reconstructed streets spread branches wide enough to cast summer shade over children who never knew why those saplings had first been placed there. Shops change owners. School teachers retire after decades spent educating pupils born entirely after the conflict. The extraordinary slowly dissolves into the ordinary, not because history has disappeared, but because daily life has patiently resumed its ancient habit of moving forward one sunrise at a time. If you were to walk through these towns many years later, you might not immediately recognize where destruction had once been greatest. Streets bustle with bicycles and buses. Market squares fill with conversation. Church bells continue marking the passing hours just as they did before the war, though many towers now contain stones laid by hands that rebuilt them rather than those that first raised them. Gardens bloom beside houses whose foundations rest partly upon the bricks of older homes that could not be saved. The landscape does not erase what happened. It quietly incorporates it. Yet beneath this calm surface, memory remains carefully tended. Families continue opening old photograph albums during winter evenings, tracing familiar faces with fingers that have themselves grown older. Grandparents tell stories that begin long before the war because they wish children to know that those who were lost had once laughed, celebrated birthdays, planted gardens, argued over small matters, and dreamed ordinary dreams. Cemeteries receive fresh flowers each spring. Names carved into stone are spoken softly during family gatherings so they remain part of living conversation rather than fading into silent history. You begin to understand that rebuilding was never only about replacing buildings. Bricks could restore walls. Timber could rebuild roofs. Steel could carry trains across rivers once more. But trust returned more slowly. Routine returned more quietly. Hope returned almost invisibly, disguised as everyday habits repeated often enough that they eventually felt natural again. The greatest achievement of those first post-war years was not that cities stood once more. It was that ordinary mornings slowly ceased feeling extraordinary. There is something profoundly human about this kind of recovery. The people who emerged from the ruins did not know they were creating examples for future generations. They were simply collecting water, repairing shoes, teaching children, planting potatoes, clearing streets, reopening schools, comforting neighbors, and writing letters whose careful handwriting carried more hope than certainty. History often remembers governments, treaties, and political transformation. Daily life remembers who shared bread when flour was scarce, who repaired the neighbor's roof before repairing their own, who kept another family's photograph safe until someone finally came home to claim it. The quiet strength of those years lay in thousands of decisions so modest they rarely entered official records. A carpenter choosing to teach an apprentice. A teacher opening another exercise book despite having too few pencils for every child. A mother sewing yet another patch onto a coat because winter would certainly come again. A railway worker believing that tomorrow's train deserved the same careful preparation as today's, even when only a handful of passengers might board it. Piece by piece, routine became an act of faith. Outside the towns, rivers continued flowing toward distant seas without concern for borders that had shifted around them. Forests thickened where abandoned roads disappeared beneath leaves and moss. Birds nested beneath church roofs rebuilt by craftsmen whose names would never appear in history books. Wind crossed fields that had once carried soldiers in every direction and now carried only the changing scent of harvests from one village to the next. Nature never forgot. Neither did it remain still. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson carried by these landscapes. The end of war is never truly the end of its consequences. Neither, however, is it the end of ordinary life. Given enough patience, enough shared labor, enough seasons measured by planting rather than destruction, people slowly rediscover how to belong to mornings instead of memories alone. The ruins become neighborhoods. The shelters become cellars once more. The temporary becomes permanent. Children inherit streets without inheriting every fear carried by those who rebuilt them. And somewhere, almost unnoticed, history quietly becomes home again. The evening grows still. Light fades gently from windows where families finish another ordinary supper before preparing for tomorrow's work. Beyond the rooftops, the wind moves through trees planted by hands that believed someone they would never meet deserved their shade. Rivers continue their patient journey beneath bridges rebuilt stone by stone. Above them all, the stars remain where they have always been, watching generations arrive, endure, rebuild, and quietly pass their hopes to those who follow. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.